The typical siege time household is a working age woman with elderly parent or parents to support and dependent children. Her husband will be at the front. So she's trying to support these people all on her own. And she, as the siege progresses, one by one members of her family will fall ill. And she is often presented with this appalling dilemma of how to distribute the resources, the rations and any other things she's managed to scrape together available to her. She has the choice about whether to try and give more food to the weakest to keep them alive, or to distribute it equally, or to write off the weakest. The demographics seem to suggest that most people saved their children. As the siege progresses, as the food begins to run out, your world becomes smaller and smaller. The public transport ceases to function. Often your workplace will cease to function. Any sort of communication with people outside your immediate apartment and apartment block, apartment building, becomes very, very difficult. You don't know what's happening to your friends and relatives elsewhere in the city, let alone to your husband off at the front. And people get trapped in this sort of iron triangle of apartment, water source, which will be a standpipe or an ice hole in one of the canals or the river, and food shop, whichever food shop they're registered at, where they spend hours and hours and hours queuing. I found it very interesting reading through the diaries, trying to work out what determined whether somebody survived or died. About a third, between a quarter and a third of the entire civilian population of the city, about 750,000 people, died during the siege. So people of every sort of different type, every strata of society died. There was nobody who escaped death completely. But a lot depended on one's own resourcefulness. I mean, people had to be incredibly sort of active and resourceful and pulling every string and self-disciplined, doing these long walks across the city to sort of see if you can barter a bit of food here or beg a canteen meal there or get a little job on the side there which might earn you a bit of firewood, or, every little helped. So it was, of course it was a lottery in many senses. And people, ultimately it was a lottery, but people who survived the siege, they loved to try and find a pattern. They loved to try and find a pattern as to who lived, who died, and there were things which affected it, but in the end, it struck everybody and anybody. I used two main categories of sources for this book. One was government documents out of the archives, chiefly the old party archive in what's now Petersburg. And second was diaries and memoirs. I also, thirdly, interviewed people who'd survived the siege, old people who'd survived the siege. There's a massive amount of material there. A lot of it, nearly all of what I put into the book, used for the book, is stuff that's been published since the collapse of the Soviet Union, since 1991. And it was interesting, the contrast between the diaries and the memoirs and the oral history. And to be honest, I found the diaries much the most useful. The stuff which was written contemporaneously there, that very evening, what happened to me today, was much more vivid and much more real. It was actually interesting that the veterans who were in their 80s, 90s, they were much more anxious to put over to me how horrible the siege was, how it was this cold, cruel time when people lost their personalities, relationships broke down, personalities broke down. We turned into stones, we turned into beasts, into wolves. These are the kind of phrases which we used again and again. They were very anxious to make it real for me and to make the nastiness and the horror of it real for me. Whereas it was their children, people now in their 60s or 70s, who were much more wedded to the Soviet version of the story, this very pasteurized version of the story where everyone's heroic and everyone comes out of it renewed, purified, better, stronger. Whereas the people who actually experienced it for themselves were much much more truthful and much keener to stress it's just sheer nastiness, how it was never happen again, and the sort of damage, this irreparable damage done. It's never been sort of pushed to one side. It's always been this big event. I mean, every school child knows about it and goes to the museums and goes to the war memorials and so on. But it got completely pasteurized. I mean, the version of it that most Russians have grown up with it's so much not the whole truth. I mean, it's just quite wrong. Not just the whole sort of facts they don't know about, like the slaughter of all these untrained sort of militia, sort of civilians who sort of had no training at all, who were sent off to the front, and there are whole facts about it they don't know about it, but also the whole tone of it is something they don't grasp and don't understand. And when I was going through things with translators, they would often be surprised and shocked at what we found. I mean, regularly surprised and shocked at what we found. And there was a lovely quote from one young woman in her 20s who helped me go through some of the more voluminous diaries, and she said rather gloomily as we got to the end of some sort of ghastly thing all about corruption, as diarists complaining of corruption in the food shops, and food theft and so on. She said, I somehow had thought that the war, during the war it was different, but now I realise it was all just the same. So it's sort of, my book is what I aim to do, what I hope I've done, is restoring realism to the whole thing, making it real again, making it how it really was.